So our theme today is, or for the month of September, is a world that works for everyone. And our topic for today is Imagine That. Our Sunday series this month, A World That Works for Everyone. Today's topic for the first Sunday in September, Imagine That. And for those of you here in the service at the center this morning, you have just listened to and perhaps even sang along with Michael Goddess as he sang the song of that same name, Imagine. And the words and the music written for that are by John Lennon back in the 1970s, the early 1970s, which I'm sure a number of you are familiar with. So you're also aware in these now moments that you are there in Waikoloa, and I'm not. I'm currently in Yorba Linda, California, and I'm presenting this talk to you through this technological wonder called FaceTime. Imagine that. Talk about a world that works for everyone through the wonder of the World Wide Web.
Bluetooth pairing.
We okay there? Okay.
Keep talking.
Okay. So talk about a world that works for everyone through the wonder of the World Wide Web, through the hardware that's displayed before you there, and we're still learning about how to best use it. And then presenting this talk to you through the technological wonder called FaceTime. Imagine that. Talk about a world that works for everyone, and that you see, in addition to that hardware, the computer that I'm creating it from, and I'm 2,000 or 2,500 miles away from you. So this month, as I travel through Europe each Sunday, we'll address how this world works ideally for others, in fact for everyone, as we explore the similarities and the differences that make up what we call the human race. The phrase, a world that works for everyone, is the global vision statement for Centers for Spiritual Living worldwide. And what I've also discovered as I began to do some research, gathering information for this talk, is that this is a saying which has broad coverage and utilization worldwide. Imagine that. I thought it had originated with us. So that's another step in opening to a world beyond the end of our nose, beyond the community in which we live, even beyond our country. And, oh, by the way, our consciousness. But before we explore that more fully, let's talk about that song, Imagine. Most of you already know that John Lennon brought his personal beliefs and crusades into his music. Imagine was one of many that reflected his mission to express those. And though not all of it was readily accepted as philosophy, much of it made history by its popularity, and by doing so, had a subtle effect on millions of listeners. The other indisputable fact is that his music is still popular almost 50 years later. And there are those who believe that it's been received all over the world as a song of peace and unity. Former President Jimmy Carter was quoted as saying, "In many countries around the world, and I've visited about 125 of them," he said, "in many countries around the world, you hear John Lennon's song, Imagine, used almost equally as often as national anthems." The word imagine is defined as to think of or create something that is not yet real in manifestation, but already real in your mind. it's also defined as to form a picture or an idea in your mind of something that's not real or present yet. As metaphysicians, though, what we know is that in order for something to become real or present in your life, it must first be formed in mind. Imagine that. And realizing this, when we study the words in that song, the message becomes crystal clear. Imagine all the people living for today. Just as we believe that the only moment is the now moment. It's to be lived in its glory and its joy. In the song, the words, imagine all the people living in peace. Just as we believe that each individual is the unique and individualized creation of God, capable of living at his or her level, yours or my level of consciousness, without fear or anger. The words from the song, imagine all the people sharing all the world. Just as we believe that all people have within them the divine qualities and attributes to raise their individual consciousness to that realization that they understand we're all one in spirit. And there's enough of God's creativity to go all the way around such that all can prosper. The words in the song, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I trust someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Well, just imagine that. And here's Ernest Holmes' thought on the subject. True imagination is not fanciful dreaming. It's fire from heaven. Some years ago, when I first began attending a Science of Mind center and started taking classes, an annual event called Adventures in Faith was presented. It continued for 7 weeks with appropriate adventures assigned to each week, both on Sunday during the celebration service and also during the week with breakout groups that were held in the private homes of members who volunteered to host small groups. Each year, Adventures in Faith had its own theme. And the first year that I attended, would you believe, the theme was Imagine. It was an exciting time for the congregation. It was inspiring, it was educational, it was fun, and it was inclusive. People shared their expressions of imagination with paintings, mobiles, food, and sometimes brief poems or short essays. One week, a fellow student of mine stepped onto the stage to share something that she had written. When I look at the word imagine, she said, as she turned to look at the sign behind her, which was hanging from the ceiling and done in beautiful leaded glass with the word imagine written across it. She said, when I look at that word, I see it as I'm a genie. I'm a genie. It reminds me, she went on to say, that a mystical spirit carries out the wishes of whoever summons them. And in that respect, she said, I bring about my wishes by summoning divine spirit to express by means of me. How unusual, how uncommon, how creative, what original thinking that brought that to the surface for her. One might even say, imagine that. You see, in a world that works for everyone, there are limitless ways to express oneself at no expense or harm to anyone else. We don't always have to agree, just to acknowledge their right to think or do differently. as long as it does no harm to others. So clearly, that's the bottom line, or the outcome we wish to see in a world that works for everyone. And now, how do I participate in such an all-encompassing unfolding? How do we cause that to happen? How does that come about? Well, first of all, consider these words. To bring anything into your life, imagine that it's already there. You may not remember who said that, but chances are good that you'll remember his name. It was Richard Bach in the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull. That then begs the question, how often in our spiritual practice do we acknowledge the things we ourselves have said and done as the example of that we wish to see? How often do we look for and acknowledge the good things people do and say? After a while, we release expecting those good things because we're seeing and hearing them repeatedly. And so we simply accept the beauty and the value of them. And that is the beginning of the change and or the growth of becoming steeped in universal consciousness. So at the top of this talk, I mentioned to you that when I Googled the phrase, a world that works for everyone, I discovered that it's been given a lot of lip service and a lot of attention from many different directions. There are several books written with that title, or ones very similar that address world oneness. There is a website titled Gaia, G-A-I-A, which some of you may already be familiar with. It's a global digital video streaming service. And it's an online community, which means there is interaction back and forth, which provides many of Werner Eckhard's ideas on the subject. Some of you may remember him from back in the late 20th century as being involved with EST. I've not yet viewed this particular website because I am not yet in possession of what's necessary to do that. So I'm just providing this information for you at this time as opposed to or compared to endorsing its content. But it's well worth taking a look at, and I know there are some people in our congregation who already have the necessary pieces of equipment in order to access that. And as most of you know, the Association for Global New Thought has been a forerunner in this area for decades. Steeped in the broad coverage of the New Thought movement, of which we are a part, the Association for Global New Thought, which is abbreviated AGNT, was born out of a deep conviction and a pure passion to give the New Thought movement a clear voice and a commanding presence on the global stage. It serves alongside the existing major New Thought entities such as us to seek out and provide new opportunities within and outside churches and spiritual centers for direct engagement with other faiths, other cultures, and issues worldwide. Additionally, so I'm going to be expanding on both of those as the weeks pass as sources of information and alliance on our part. And additionally, next week, I'll be discussing with you some of the ideas developed by Buckminster Fuller, which may be a familiar name to some of you. He was a world-renowned American architect. He was a systems theorist. That's an interesting title, isn't it? An author, a designer, an inventor, and the word he was the proudest of, futurist. Futurist. So, a world that works for anyone certainly is embraced by the philosophy and the spiritual basis of the science of mind. The basis of our teaching is to consciously become one with the source of our being and accepting that the qualities and the attributes of our Creator, God, Divine Spirit, creative intelligence, reside within each one of us. That certainly embraces the realization that each individual human being is inextricably linked to every other individual human being. And that we are way past the outdated belief that we must continue to separate from each other in order to survive, when quite the opposite is true. In order to survive, we must be as one. Here are the words of Reverend Dr. Michael Bernard Beckwith, who is the spiritual director of Agape International Spiritual Center in Southern California. We are unlimited beings. We have no ceiling. The capabilities, talents, unlimited gifts, and powers that are within every single individual on this planet are unlimited. At core, it's really so logical. We're all here to support and encourage each other. For what other reason would we be created with individual characteristics, individual capabilities, individual talents, gifts, individual powers? Of course, we don't all look alike. That would be cookie cutter, and that would be boring. Well, maybe not if it was you, but most of us would be pretty boring, reproduced 7 billion times over. Of course, we're diverse. Otherwise, there would be no progress, no reason for anything to change. Our Creator is the poster expression for a world that works for everyone, because everyone is contained within that poster. We are all called to imagine that. And so it is.